In the spring of 1947, a man named Shiro Ishii walked out of a Tokyo building a free man. He had never been charged with a crime. He had never stood before a tribunal. He had never been asked to account for the thousands of prisoners he had watched die in his laboratories. Chinese civilians, Soviet soldiers, American POWs, subjected to vivisections, frostbite experiments, plague inoculations, and pressure chamber tests. Ishii walked free, not because there was insufficient evidence against him. There was overwhelming evidence. He walked free because the United States government made a business decision. Washington wanted what Ishii had built, and immunity was the price. The dominant story is that America extended leniency to certain Japanese figures in the interest of stability, peace, and the efficient administration of a defeated nation. That story is not entirely false, but it is radically incomplete. The immunity extended to Ishii and the officers and scientists of Unit 731 was not a reluctant compromise forced by Cold War pragmatism. It was an acquisition strategy. The United States was buying data, buying networks, buying leverage, and the currency it used was impunity. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research program operated by the Imperial Japanese Army in Manchuria, responsible for the deaths of an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 documented victims. What almost nobody discusses is the systematic, deliberate, documented decision by American military intelligence to suppress that evidence at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. That decision did not happen in a fog of uncertainty. It happened in memos. It happened in cables. It happened in face-to-face negotiations conducted by American officers who knew exactly what they were doing. The memos are declassified. The names are on the pages. The reasoning is stated explicitly. This is not a story that requires you to read between lines. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo beginning in May 1946, was modeled on the Nuremberg proceedings, but haunted by a set of political pressures that Nuremberg never fully had to navigate. The tribunal's chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, was a political appointee with no significant international law background, selected partly because of his loyalty to the Truman administration. The procedural rules were written entirely by the Americans, and the Americans retained effective veto power over which charges would be pursued, which evidence would be entered, and which witnesses would be called. Emperor Hirohito was never charged. The decision to immunize the emperor was made at the highest levels of the American Occupations Authority under General Douglas MacArthur. Historian Herbert Bix documented in painstaking detail the extent to which American officials actively coached Japanese witnesses on how to deflect criminal responsibility away from the emperor. The prosecution pursued 28 defendants, while the architecture of accountability had already been quietly hollowed out at its foundation. 7 men were ultimately executed. 16 received life sentences, and waiting entirely outside the courtroom, never summoned, never named in any indictment, was Shiro Ishii. Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited former Nazi scientists into the United States government and military-industrial complex, had already established the foundational premise. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians through paperclip and related programs. Many had direct ties to slave labor and concentration camp experiments. The Soviets were acquiring their own tranche of Japanese biological weapons researchers, a fact American intelligence was tracking closely, and that added urgency to Washington's own acquisition efforts. The Tokyo immunity deal is often treated as an anomaly, a one-off decision made under exceptional Cold War pressure. But when you place it alongside paperclip, you see that it was part of a pattern, a repeating structural preference for technical acquisition over legal accountability was baked into the American post-war national security apparatus from the beginning. The men who negotiated with Ishii knew they were working within an established framework. They were not improvising. They were executing a policy. The conventional defense runs roughly as follows. The United States was looking at adversaries in the Soviet Union that was openly hostile, rapidly militarizing, and actively seeking to acquire the same biological and chemical weapons data. Japan in 1947 was a devastated country sitting at the edge of the Pacific, its stability directly relevant to American strategic interests in the region. There is partial truth in this. The occupation was a genuine balancing act. The Cold War pressure was real, but the immunity extended to Ishii and his colleagues was not calibrated to the minimum necessary to preserve occupation stability. It was calibrated to the maximum benefit the United States could extract from the relationship. Edwin Hill and Joseph Victor, two American scientists who conducted the official debriefing of Unit 731 researchers in 1947, submitted a report describing the data as invaluable. They recommended that the cost of obtaining it through legitimate research would have been prohibitive. That word, prohibitive, is the tell. It is not the language of necessity. It is the language of a bargain. Washington wasn't protecting the occupation. Washington was shopping, which brings us to the money. Not the metaphorical money of strategic interests and geopolitical capital, but the actual financial architecture that made the immunity deal not just politically convenient, but economically rational. The United States Biological War Program in the post-war period was administered primarily through Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, established in 1943 and operating on a budget, placing it among the most heavily funded covert research programs in the American military. The program's leadership had a direct institutional interest in acquiring Unit 731's data, not because the Cold War abstractly required it, but because that data represented years of human experimental research that would have been prohibitively expensive to replicate. Unit 731 had conducted human experiments on a scale that no ethical review board, no institutional framework, no legal structure in the United States would have permitted. The immunity deal was, at its core, a mechanism for offloading the moral and legal cost of producing that data onto the victims of a foreign atrocity, and then purchasing the results at the price of impunity. Shiro Ishii received his immunity. He retired to a life of quiet comfort in Japan, reportedly continuing to consult with American military researchers on an informal basis into the 1950s. His deputy, Masashi Kitano, went on to lead Green Cross Corporation, a major Japanese pharmaceutical company where he worked for decades without ever having been asked to account for his wartime role. The research programs at Fort Detrick expanded significantly in the post-war decade, drawing on data streams whose origins were deliberately obscured in the institutional record. The private cost of the most morally catastrophic research in the program's history was borne entirely by the people who died in Manchuria. The institutional benefit flowed entirely to American military science. Australian prosecutor William Webb, who served as the presiding judge of the Tokyo Tribunal, was aware of the Unit 731 issue and was deeply uncomfortable with the direction the American prosecution team was taking. The Soviets submitted documentary evidence about Unit 731 activities and pushed for the issue to be investigated. Keenan and the American prosecution team worked systematically to suppress that evidence and keep the subject out of the formal record. Inside the occupation's legal apparatus, individuals wrote internal objections. They describe, in bureaucratic language, concerns about the precedent being set, and the risks if it became publicly known the United States was negotiating immunity for men whose crimes were arguably worse than those being prosecuted. These concerns were noted, filed, and overridden. As historian Sheldon Harris documented in his 1994 work, Factories of Death, the occupation authorities' intelligence services developed an active interest in managing public information about Unit 731 that persisted well beyond the immediate post-war period. Japanese journals who began investigating the stories in the late 1940s found their sources pressured, their access to official records blocked, and their publications subjected to occupation censorship under the Civil Censorship Detachment. The illegitimacy wasn't just baked into the founding arrangement. It was actively maintained, year by year, through institutional mechanisms designed to keep the arrangement invisible. When I first started tracing the paper trail on Unit 731 immunity, reading the declassified cables, going through the Hill and Victor report, there was a specific moment when the scale of what had happened became fully clear to me. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. It was the accumulation of small, precise, documented decisions, each one logged in official language, each one representing a choice made by named individuals in institutional roles. Scholars like Sheldon Harris, Hal Gold, and Keiichi Tsuneishi have written careful, sourced, academic histories of Unit 731 and the immunity deal that are available in university libraries and on interlibrary loan. The information is obscure, not because it has been suppressed with great efficiency, but because it sits in a category that our public discourse has enormous difficulty metabolizing. The Tokyo trials are taught as a chapter in the story of humanity's progressive commitment to accountability. The immunity deal is the part of that chapter that doesn't get read aloud. The distance between what is documented and what is commonly known is itself a data point. It tells you something about how institutions manage their own histories. In 1981, journalist John Powell was threatened with prosecution under the Foreign Agents Registration Act in connection with his reporting on American biological warfare activities during the Korean War. Powell had published articles arguing that the United States had used biological weapons in Korea, drawing on evidence including documentation of Unit 731's activities and the post-war relationship between American military scientists and former Unit 731 personnel. The Korean War had generated persistent allegations that American forces had deployed biological agents, investigated by an international scientific commission that produced the Needham Report, finding evidence consistent with biological weapons use. The founding moral compromise had downstream operational consequences. The architecture of the arrangement: immunity for data, data for research, research for deployment, was not a historical artifact. It was a functioning system. Nobusuke Kishi had been a senior figure in the wartime Japanese government, bearing direct responsibility for the use of forced labor in Japanese-controlled Manchuria. He was arrested after the war, classified as a Class A war crime suspect, and held at Sugamo prison. He was never charged. In 1948, he was released. By 1957, he was Prime Minister of Japan. American intelligence services had identified Kishi as a useful asset, a man with extensive political networks, and a demonstrated willingness to subordinate Japanese national interests to American strategic requirements when the institutional incentives were correctly arranged. The Liberal Democratic Party, which Kishi helped found, and which has governed Japan for the overwhelming majority of the post-war period, was in its formative years substantially funded through CIA channels. Kishi delivered what the Americans wanted: a Japan firmly in the American security orbit, committed to the revised U.S.-Japan Security Treaty of 1960. What he received in return was rehabilitation, power, and protection from accountability. His grandson, Shinzo Abe, would go on to serve as Japan's longest-tenured prime minister in modern history. The elite capture of Japan's post-war political establishment produced a dynastic political structure whose consequences are still being lived out in the present. The pattern: immunity exchanged for utility, utility generating political power protecting the original immunity. Repeated across the Japanese corporate world and the political networks connecting the post-war Liberal Democratic Party to its wartime predecessors. It was not a scandal, it was a system. So where does that leave us today? Fort Detrick's biological research programs continued to expand through the 1950s and 1960s, reaching a peak operational budget in the late 1960s that, adjusted for inflation, would represent billions of dollars in today's terms. President Nixon ordered the unilateral termination of the American Offensive Biological Weapons Program in 1969, and the United States ratified the Biological Weapons Convention in 1975. Those are genuine policy decisions with genuine significance. But they do not resolve the foundational question that the Unit 731 immunity deal poses. The question is whether the institutional logic that produced the immunity deal, the logic that says strategic and commercial interests can legitimately override legal and moral accountability when the stakes are high enough, and that the costs of that override can be assigned to people who have no power to refuse, has ever been structurally reformed. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty remains in force. The Liberal Democratic Party, whose founding architecture included the rehabilitation of war crimes suspects as American intelligence assets, governs Japan today. The pharmaceutical company that employed Unit 731's deputy commander, Green Cross Corporation, operated under that name until 1998, when it merged with Yoshitomi Pharmaceutical, a merger driven partly by financial scandal, but one that dissolved the corporate identity without any reckoning with its origins. The data produced by Unit 731's experiments is embedded in the research lineage of American biological defense programs in ways that have never been fully audited or publicly disclosed. The annual budget of the United States Biological Defense Program currently runs to approximately $2 billion per year, according to published federal budget documents. $2 billion annually, flowing through an institutional framework whose founding inputs included the deliberate suppression of war crimes, evidence, the personal enrichment and rehabilitation of mass murderers, and the systematic exclusion of victims from any form of legal acknowledgement. That $2 billion is not the measure of an injustice. Injustice doesn't have a clean price tag, but it is the measure of an institution. And institutions carry their founding logic forward in ways that are not always visible in their current operations, but that shape, in fundamental ways, what those operations are willing to do and unwilling to question. The victims of Unit 731. The thousands of people who died in Ishii's laboratories, in field deployment experiments, in documented operations against Chinese civilian populations, received no formal acknowledgement from the United States government. The Japanese government's official position for decades was that Unit 730's activities were unproven, a stance that required the active cooperation of a historical record that the American Occupation Authority had spent years helping to manage. Survivor testimony, painstakingly gathered by researchers and journalists over decades, exists in abundance. The documentary evidence in American archives corroborating that testimony exists in abundance. The gap between what is documented and what has been officially acknowledged remains, to this day, one of the most precisely measurable silences in the modern historical record. Shiro Ishii died in 1959 of throat cancer in Tokyo. He was never charged. He was never tried. He was, in the most precise legal sense available, an innocent man. The system that produced that outcome was not broken. It worked exactly as designed. And the question that the full weight of this history places in front of us, the question I don't think has a comfortable answer, is simply this. When an institution is built on a transaction that everyone involved understood to be wrong, and when that institution's annual budget is measured in billions, and its political reach extends across the most consequential alliance in the Pacific, at what point does acknowledging the founding wrong become not just a matter of historical honesty, but a prerequisite for trusting anything the institution does next?